Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to the channel. This is Cam with Stoic Soldier. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. Hope everyone's had a fantastic week. Hope everyone's having a great day so far. And as promised, here is your video of the week. Now, as I've mentioned in the past, I've always been a student of learning, always been fascinated and enamored with countless different ideologies, philosophies, different areas of study, different schools of thought that have really reshaped me, reshaped who I am, reshaped my personality, my perspective, my way of thinking, thought process. And especially over the last couple years, and even more so from a decade ago, I've finally come to the point where I'm unrecognizable from who I was. Looking back at the person now, I have no idea who that was. And that just goes to show that no matter who you are and what circumstance you might be in, every day, every second, every passing minute is a new opportunity to reinvent yourself. Many of the greats have done so time and time again. Many notable names that we're all familiar with. And it happens time and time again. The number one thing that it starts with is this. It starts with your thought process. It starts with the way you think. It starts with what you're telling yourself. It starts with your affirmations. It starts with the way that you communicate with yourself. Now, for those who may or may not be really deeply enamored with spirituality and the cosmos and sacred doctrines that go really in depth about vibration and frequency the way that I've been, to put it in simplistic terms, for whatever you believe in, again, your thoughts do dictate your reality. Something as simple as I'm going to wake up today and I'm going to have a great day, or I'm going to have a horrible day. You just set everything in motion. You set yourself in motion to either have a great day or a horrible day. Your thoughts are everything. The way that you interpret information, the way you process information is everything. That could be as to the way that you study for a test, the way that you understand the job that you're doing, the way that you conduct business, the way that you think, and the way that you're able to interpret it and especially communicate that with other people is pretty much bread and butter right there. So that is one of the main things, probably even the main thing that has changed about me over the last several years. And Stoicism has definitely been one of those schools of thought that have made a huge difference, again, along with Taoism, which I will be discussing later on in different videos. Now, all that aside, I also did promise you guys that I'd be going into a little bit more detail about some of my own personal experiences, things that I've endured and gone through, and more importantly, why they've led me down the path that I've been, why they've led me to these journeys, why they've led me to ultimately learning these things that I've learned and becoming who I am. And I'm sure many of you have had that. Many of the most notable greats in just about any field, in any industry, I'm sure they all have that. People go into music, some of the more, not necessarily always disturbed, but people who have had rough childhoods, people who've dealt with great adversity, in any industry. People like, Michael Jackson, people like Eminem, people like Tupac, or even if you're into classical, people like Beethoven. Everybody's been led down a certain path because of what they had been through, because of the journey they started on. It had some contribution, but it doesn't have to dictate the entirety of it. As I said, there are still things that you can adjust with and fine tune as you go along, and not have to keep that original trajectory that you had early on. Sure, you can be grateful for it because it helped transform you, and as we all know, there's no such thing as a wasted experience. With every experience comes some degree of knowledge that you didn't have before, a new way of thinking, a new set of wisdom that you didn't have before. So, good or bad, be grateful for it. So, as far as the ways of thinking that have really changed me, Given who I was a very overly attached individual, not necessarily when it comes to people, not necessarily when it comes to clinginess, but I was very attached to outcomes. I was constantly fixated to the point where I was just driving myself completely insane over anything that would or wouldn't happen, thinking that somehow it was a poor reflection of me, thinking that somehow it determined as to whether or not I was a failure or a success. And that is a horrible way of thinking. That is a toxic, unhealthy way to live your life. Because if you constantly feel like you're walking on eggshells everywhere you go, you are intentionally giving yourself, you're not intentionally, you're consciously and subconsciously giving yourself anxiety, and you're literally planting it in your system. You're making that not just part of who you are, but you're ultimately making that your personality, somebody who's always a nervous wreck. And when you live like that, you're constantly in that state of fear. You're not going to be able to make conscious decisions. So, me understanding detachment from the outcomes, being able to be indifferent, as a lot of Stoics have noted countless times, whether you talk about any one of the greats, be it Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, especially being one of the greats, one common theme that you notice amongst most of these guys, not every single one of them, is the idea of detachment. Detachment, indifference, apathy, if you want to go really extreme, but just liberating yourself from this idea that everything has to be in your control and that everything has to be perfect. Again, there's no such thing as perfect. Nothing is perfect. In fact, imperfection is perfection. Because as we talked about before, concept of duality, light and dark, positive, negative, right and wrong, you'd have nothing to compare the two. If you don't know one, you're not going to know the other. You're not going to know dark if you don't know light, and you're not going to know light if you don't know dark. So, flaws and qualities they're everywhere. Good and bad are everywhere. Everything is going to be flawed. Everything's going to have its ups and downs, because anything and anyone being perfect 24/7 is just not realistic. And that's putting too much pressure on yourself. We're all putting too much pressure on ourselves by thinking that that's how it's supposed to be. It's not possible to maintain that long term. So every once in a while, you have to be willing to tell yourself it's okay if things aren't exactly as they're supposed to be, exactly the way that I pictured it in my head. It's okay. You're allowed to not be perfect. Okay? Let yourself detach. Let yourself go every once in a while. That doesn't mean be lazy and just do nothing, but allow yourself to be free if even when you put in the work, things don't go out exactly as you planned, and let yourself just be at ease with that. And this way of thinking especially applies when it comes to people. I myself, long story short, have had family members, I've had past relationships, I've had friends who have struggled with substance abuse, who have had unhealthy lifestyles, people who have messed around with just about anything that you can imagine. And since I was a kid, I always thought to myself that I need to be this white knight, that I need to be this savior, that I'm the one who needs to go out and rescue these people. And that was one of the worst mistakes I could have made. Because as I noted before, as many of us probably know, we are not responsible for anyone else except ourselves. Now, by no means does that indicate that you don't help whoever you can, when you can, if you can, and however you can. If it's not financially, maybe you can give them some sound advice. If you can't do that, maybe you can refer them to somebody who can. Help however you can. By no means am I advocating that we all become selfish, because that's not the kind of people that we should be. That's not the kind of world we should live in. But don't go out of your way to the point where you're sacrificing yourself, especially when you know that this is a lost cause. Now, how to determine if it's a lost cause? That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a hard fight, because a lot of us have had our battles, we've had our adversities, we've had our trials and tribulations, but with the right help and then ultimately developing the right mindset, it could happen. When you see The way you know it's a lost cause is when you know that you've offered everything to them and they didn't even bother to blink. Because what do they always say? The first step is admitting that you have a problem. First step is admitting that there's something wrong. If they're not even able and willing to do that, you standing there regardless, that's just enabling them. And those who don't want to be helped cannot be helped. They need to change for themselves. Again, man in the mirror, that's the only individual that you guys can, should, and will change. There was one line from this show that I really come to love. It's still probably one of my favorite shows of all time, Bates Motel. I'm sure you guys are familiar with it. It's the modern day adaptation of Psycho, kind of a spin-off of it. And there was this one scene in the show where Norman Bates was having a sit down with his brother Dylan, and they were talking about moving out together, but he didn't want to leave his mom. And given how toxic and unhealthy she was to be around, I kind of resonated with that myself. And the minute I heard these words, they stuck with me forever. And then from there, I completely isolated from any such individuals in my life. He said, she's an addict. And when it comes to an addict, the best thing you can do for them and for you is to walk away. Because by you walking away, you're communicating, even though there's no hate and resentment necessarily, I'm still going to choose a different path. This is not the path that I want. If it's for you, great. If not, well, I've left the door open. And you can walk through at any time, but you have to be the one to turn the knob. By you walking and living your own life, regardless, not because of, not in spite of, but regardless of what anyone else says or does or thinks, whether that be strangers or whether that be people you know, you've made it clear that you are your own man. You've made it clear that you are your own individual, and no one and nothing is going to change that. And this is how leaders are born. A leader versus a boss. One leads by example, one is a role model, and then one just talks, one just barks orders, one tries to tell people what to do. And as we know, no one wants to be lectured, so you just leave it be. When and if they're ready, when and if they decide that enough is enough, when they have that epiphany, then when they're left with themselves only, and they have to face that, who they are, who they've become, what they've allowed themselves to turn into, when they become uncomfortable enough with that, then and only then will they be grateful that they had an individual who was able and willing to help them, and that if the option is still available, they can go back. But again, they got to do it themselves. By you walking away and choosing to live your own life, first and foremost, to save yourself, you've already become an inspiration to others. You've already made it clear that no circumstance, no individual is going to change who you are, and you're not going to sink down to that level. You're not going to sink down to that low frequency. You're not going to jump into that abyss. You're not going to jump down into that well without a rope, without a ladder, without any kind of help, and expect to get the other person out, because now you guys are both trapped in there. This is how leaders are born. Leaders think freely for themselves. They're indifferent to anything that they can't control, but they still do what they can. That's someone who can't be fazed, but someone who's still willing to, no matter what, do what they have to do. They know they have a mission to accomplish. Regardless of how they feel, they still get it done. Regardless of whether they feel tired or they feel lazy or they feel depressed. That is another aspect of indifference. Doing things that you have to do regardless. So I really want you guys to keep that in mind. For those of you who are struggling with people in your life that you might not necessarily be able to help, or that you can't walk away from, at the very least, still being able and willing to find time for yourself, to save yourself, and do, again, whatever you can when you can, especially depending on how important these individuals are or what the situation is. I don't know everybody's, but still making time for yourself and still saving yourself. Okay? especially when it comes to people who are making these choices voluntarily. You don't have to follow. Those who genuinely care for you, they will still be there for you. And if they genuinely want to be part of your life, they will follow you. Otherwise, you did yourself a favor, and then more than likely you did them a favor. They can continue to live how they want to live, and now you can live a healthy, strong, virtuous life. Cool. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today, guys. Thank you all again so much for joining me. Hope everyone enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. This would really be helpful to the channel. And I hope you guys are continuing to have a fantastic day. And I will see you guys next week. Stoic Soldier, out.